In Willow Springs, the church was more than a place of worship. It was a pillar of tradition. Samantha Turner had always found peace in these walls, organizing events like the annual Fundraiser, which was both a community highlight and her personal source of purpose. The night of the event buzzed with chatter and laughter. String lights twinkled along the walls, and the warm scent of cider and baked goods filled the air. Samantha moved through the crowd, her heart light with satisfaction as she greeted guests and tidied tables. It was a night to celebrate, but then something caught her eye. Just a fleeting moment. David, her husband, standing too close to Rachel, her best friend of over a decade. At first it was easy to dismiss. Rachel had always been friendly, and David was naturally charming, but their laughter felt different, too soft, too personal. Samantha's smile faltered as Rachel's hand brushed David's shoulder in a way that made her stomach twist. She shook off the feeling. After all, David and Rachel were like family. They couldn't possibly. And yet, as the evening unfolded, the strange unease crept back. Every time Samantha turned around, she found David and Rachel together, sharing glances, disappearing into quiet corners, emerging with inside jokes. At one point, she caught them standing under the dim hallway lights, whispering conspiratorially. A spark of fear flickered in Samantha's chest. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe she was tired, worn out from planning the event, but deep down, Samantha knew something wasn't right. David's laugh lingered too long. Rachel's gaze was too familiar. The way they interacted felt more intimate than friendship allowed. As the night wound down and the guests drifted home, Samantha lingered in the empty church hall, her thoughts swirling. David was outside helping with guests' bags, and Rachel had vanished without a word. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, mirroring the uncertainty stirring inside her. Samantha's heart was heavy, her mind unwilling to accept the conclusions forming. Was she seeing things that weren't there? Or had everything she believed, her marriage, her friendships, begun to unravel right before her eyes? With a sigh, she brushed away the tears threatening to fall. Something had shifted tonight, and there was no denying it. Life, as she knew it, was already beginning to change. The next morning, Samantha woke with a dull ache in her chest, the uneasy feeling from the night before still lingering like a shadow. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that exhaustion had clouded her mind. But as sunlight filtered through the curtains, the nagging doubts persisted. David's absence at breakfast didn't help. He had left early, citing errands, but Samantha couldn't ignore the lingering discomfort. Images from the previous night replayed in her mind. Rachel's hand on David's shoulder, their shared glances, the way they slipped away from the crowd. It was too much to dismiss. By late morning, Samantha decided she needed clarity. She had to confront the growing unease before it consumed her. Grabbing a tray of leftover pastries from the fundraiser, she drove to Rachel's house. Her heart pounded as she stood at the door, trying to convince herself this was just a friendly visit. But deep down, she knew she was looking for something, anything to confirm or dispel her fears. Rachel greeted her warmly, pulling her into a hug. "Sam, you didn't have to bring these, but I'm glad you did. Come in." Rachel's smile was bright, but Samantha noticed a flicker of tension beneath it. They sat in the cozy living room, sipping coffee and chatting about the fundraiser. Rachel's laughter sounded easy, but Samantha could sense an underlying nervousness, a hesitation just barely hidden beneath the surface. Samantha forced herself to ease into the conversation. "You seemed really busy last night," she said casually, stirring her coffee. "I saw you talking with David quite a bit." Rachel's smile didn't waver, but Samantha noticed the slightest pause before she responded. "Oh, yeah," Rachel said, laughing lightly. "We were just going over some last-minute stuff. You know how these things are, always something to fix." The response was smooth, too smooth. Samantha leaned forward slightly. "It must have been important," she added, her tone light but probing. "I noticed you two kept sneaking off." Rachel's hand twitched slightly, her cheerful demeanor faltering for a split second. "David's just easy to talk to, you know that," she said with a casual shrug, though her gaze drifted away from Samantha's. Before Samantha could press further, Rachel's phone buzzed on the counter. David's name flashed across the screen, making Samantha's heart skip a beat. Rachel's hand darted out to flip the phone over. "Just the event planning group," Rachel said quickly, her smile a little too tight. Samantha returned the smile, but inside, the knot in her stomach tightened. The doubts that had plagued her since last night no longer felt like paranoia. They were real, and they were becoming harder to ignore. As Samantha stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the sun. Something was happening between David and Rachel, something she couldn't yet understand, but knew she had to uncover. With every step back to her car, Samantha felt herself edging closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But one thing was certain. The life she thought she knew was already slipping away, and there was no turning back now. Over the next few days, Samantha tried to go about her routine, but the weight of her suspicions clung to her. Every glance from David, every mention of Rachel's name, felt like a jab at her already frayed nerves. His laughter seemed forced, and every time his phone buzzed, Samantha wondered if Rachel was on the other end of the message. She kept telling herself to stop. Maybe it was nothing, maybe she was overthinking, but the small moments, the sideways glances, the hushed conversations, gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. One evening, she sat at the dinner table with David, watching him quietly. He scrolled through his phone as he ate, oblivious to her gaze. The rhythmic clinking of his fork against the plate and the ticking of the wall clock only heightened the uneasy silence between them. David finally glanced up, meeting her stare. "You okay, Sam? You've been quiet all night." Samantha hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've just been thinking," she said slowly. "You've been spending a lot of time with Rachel lately, haven't you?" David's expression remained neutral, but Samantha caught the slightest flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Yeah, for the fundraiser. You know how busy she's been." He gave a casual shrug, as if the question were of no consequence. Samantha leaned in slightly, her tone calm but deliberate. "You didn't tell me you met with her the night before the fundraiser." David's fork froze mid-air for just a moment before he set it down. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I must have forgotten. It wasn't a big deal. We just went over some last-minute stuff." The explanation was simple, reasonable, but Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. The easy shrug, the careful choice of words. It all felt too calculated, too convenient. David reached for her hand across the table, his voice softening. "Is everything okay? You seem distant." Samantha forced a tight smile, pulling her hand away. "I'm fine," she said, though the knot in her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let the conversation end here, but deep down she knew she couldn't. That night, as they lay in bed, Samantha stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The words David had said replayed over and over, each time sounding more hollow than the last. She wanted to believe it was just paranoia. She wanted to trust her husband. But something inside her whispered otherwise, and Samantha knew that if she wanted peace, she had to uncover the truth, even if it shattered everything. As she lay in the darkness, she made herself a silent promise. No more guessing, no more wondering. She would get to the bottom of whatever was happening between David and Rachel, no matter what it cost, and she knew, with a heavy heart, that once the truth came out, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Samantha woke with a sense of grim determination. She couldn't live in uncertainty any longer. If her suspicions were wrong, she needed to lay them to rest. But if they were right, then she had to know for sure. After David left for work, Samantha sat at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop. It felt wrong to invade his privacy. This was something she had never done before. But desperate times called for desperate measures. She opened the laptop, her hands trembling slightly as she navigated to his emails. At first, everything seemed normal. Church announcements, work-related messages, reminders from family. Just as she started to feel a flicker of guilt, she found it, an email from Rachel, dated the night before the fundraiser. "Thanks for tonight. I really needed to talk. Same time next week?" Samantha's heart sank as she stared at the message. The words were vague, but they carried weight. This wasn't a casual meeting or church business. It was something more. Her hands cold, Samantha continued her search. She opened David's calendar, and her breath caught. There, tucked between other mundane appointments, was an entry. Meeting with R. The scheduled time matched the email, and the location, a restaurant far from the church on the outskirts of town. Samantha's pulse quickened. The meeting had been planned, deliberate, and carefully hidden from her. Determined to find more, she moved to David's phone, which sat charging on the kitchen counter. Unlocking it with a shaking hand, she scrolled through his messages. Most were routine, work chats, group messages, reminders. But when she opened the thread with Rachel, her heart dropped. The conversation was sparse, too clean. There were gaps in the timeline, especially on the days Samantha knew David had been with Rachel. It was clear that messages had been deleted, but one text stood out, untouched. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Let's not tell anyone." The words hit Samantha like a punch to the gut. This was no misunderstanding. There was something between them, something David had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Her breath came in short bursts as she set the phone down, her mind spinning. David had lied to her, and Rachel, the friend she had trusted for years, had betrayed her. Samantha wanted to scream, to cry, to smash the phone in her hand, but she held it together, at least for now. She needed to think. She needed to understand the full extent of their betrayal before she confronted either of them. With a deep breath, she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had uncovered. One thing was certain: life as she knew it was gone. And the truth, now uncovered, left her with more questions than answers. But Samantha wasn't finished yet. There was still more to find, and no matter how painful, she would uncover it all. That afternoon, Samantha knew it was time to take the next step. The betrayal was undeniable, but she needed to hear it from Rachel herself. With her heart pounding, she grabbed her car keys and drove to Rachel's house, her thoughts swirling with anger and hurt. Rachel answered the door with her usual warm smile, but Samantha saw the tension beneath it, something guarded in her eyes. "Sam, this is a surprise. Everything okay?" Rachel asked, stepping aside to let her in. Samantha stepped through the doorway, her jaw tight. "We need to talk." Rachel's smile faltered, but she nodded and led her into the living room. They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "I know about you and David," Samantha said bluntly, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "And I know it wasn't just about the fundraiser." Rachel's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks. She looked as if she wanted to deny it, but Samantha's expression left no room for lies. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" Samantha snapped, her voice cracking under the strain of suppressed emotion. "Why would you betray me like this?" Rachel wrung her hands nervously. "It wasn't planned, Sam. It just happened. I didn't know how to stop it." Samantha let out a bitter laugh, disbelief and fury bubbling to the surface. "You didn't know how to stop sneaking around with my husband? Really, Rachel?" Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she dropped her gaze to the floor. "I know I ruined everything," she whispered. "I'll never forgive myself for it. But please, believe me, I never wanted to lose you." Samantha's heart clenched, her mind spinning with anger, sadness and betrayal. "You already have," she said quietly. "You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't worth the truth." The room fell into a heavy silence, the years of friendship between them shattered beyond repair. Samantha stared at the woman she had once called a sister, feeling as if she were looking at a stranger. Finally, Samantha stood, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I hope it was worth it," she whispered, "because you've lost me, and you've lost him too." Rachel's lips trembled, but Samantha didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her heart heavy but resolute. There was no going back, not from this. As she stepped into the cool autumn air, a strange sense of relief washed over her. She felt raw and broken, but also free. Free from the lies, the deceit, and the friendship that had been poisoned beyond repair. There was still one person left to confront, and this time there would be no mercy. That evening, Samantha sat in the dimly lit living room, waiting for David to return home. The confrontation with Rachel still echoed in her mind, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. She had faced her friend, but now it was time to confront the man she had shared her life with. The sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. David walked in, setting his bag down by the door. He looked tired, almost relieved to be home. "Hey, Sam," he greeted her, kicking off his shoes. "How was your day?" Samantha didn't respond immediately. She stayed seated, watching him carefully, trying to read the expression on his face. Was there guilt, remorse, or something darker? David finally noticed her silence, his smile fading as he approached. "Is something wrong?" Samantha's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "We need to talk." David's posture stiffened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "What about?" Samantha leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I know you've been meeting Rachel," she said bluntly. "And I know it wasn't just for the fundraiser." For a moment, David stood frozen, as if the ground beneath him had given way. His lips parted, but no words came. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Sam, it's not what you think." Samantha's jaw tightened. "Then tell me what it is," she challenged, her voice sharper now. David sank into the armchair across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "It started a few months ago," he admitted, his voice low. "We got close. Too close. But I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." The words hit Samantha like a punch to the chest, even though she had suspected it all along. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me?" David shook his head, guilt etched across his face. "I don't know. I was stupid. I let things go too far." Samantha blinked back tears, anger and sadness twisting inside her. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You made me believe everything was fine while you were sneaking around behind my back." David leaned forward, his voice thick with desperation. "I never wanted to hurt you, Sam. I swear." "But you did," she whispered, the weight of his betrayal crushing her. "You destroyed everything we had." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. David looked at her with pleading eyes, but Samantha knew there was nothing he could say to make things right. The betrayal was too deep, the damage irreparable. After a long moment, David spoke again, his voice barely audible. "It's over. Whatever it was, it's done." Samantha let out a bitter laugh. "Do you really think that makes a difference now?" David's shoulders slumped, his hands dangling between his knees. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. Samantha stared at him, her heart aching with the realization that the life they had built was gone, shattered beyond repair. "I don't think you can," she said quietly, her voice hollow. They sat in silence, the weight of their broken marriage hanging between them. Samantha knew she had reached a turning point. There was no going back, no pretending things were still the same. And as much as she had loved David, she knew that love wasn't enough to save them. After a long pause, Samantha rose from the couch, her movements slow and deliberate. "I need space," she whispered. "I need to think." David didn't try to stop her. He watched her walk away, his expression a mixture of regret and defeat. But Samantha knew that regret wasn't enough. Not now, not ever. As she closed the bedroom door behind her, she leaned against it, exhaling a shaky breath. She had taken the first step toward facing the truth, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The night stretched on, heavy with unanswered questions and unspoken words. Samantha lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The marriage she had fought to protect was crumbling before her eyes, and there was no salvaging what had been lost. One thing was certain, this was only the beginning of the end. And no matter where the road led, Samantha knew she couldn't walk it with David. Not anymore. The next morning, Samantha moved through the house like a ghost, her mind clouded by the events of the previous night. Every breath felt heavy, every movement sluggish, as if her body was weighed down by the gravity of what she had uncovered. She thought about leaving, about taking a break from the home she no longer recognized as her sanctuary, but something kept her rooted in place. Just before noon, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, startling her out of her thoughts. She reached for it absent-mindedly, expecting a message from David, or worse, from Rachel. Instead, an unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. With growing unease, she answered the call. "Hello?" A man's voice came through the line, stern yet cautious. "Is this Samantha Turner?" "Yes, this is she. Who's calling?" "This is Officer Reynolds with the Willow Springs Police Department." His voice was steady, but Samantha could sense the weight of what he was about to say. "I'm sorry to inform you, but Rachel Williams was found dead this morning." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep herself steady, her mind struggling to grasp what she had just heard. "What?" she whispered. "What do you mean? How did it happen?" "She was found behind the church," the officer said grimly. "It appears she was the victim of a violent attack. We're still gathering information, but I need to ask you a few questions." Samantha's heart raced, her thoughts spinning in all directions. Rachel was dead, murdered. The friend she had confronted just yesterday was now gone, violently ripped from the world. The church, the place where it had all started to unravel, had become the site of something far worse. "When did this happen?" Samantha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We believe it occurred late last night," Officer Reynolds replied. "We're still working to establish a clear timeline. I understand this must be difficult, but we'll need to speak with you and Mr. Turner soon." Samantha numbly agreed to cooperate, though her mind was far from the conversation. As she hung up the phone, she sank into a chair, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Rachel was gone. Not just gone, but murdered. The betrayal, the lies, they all seemed meaningless in the face of this brutal end. Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as images of Rachel flooded her mind. Her smile, her laugh, the years of friendship they had shared. Despite everything, she hadn't wanted this. She had wanted the truth, not a violent, irreversible end. Her thoughts spiraled. Who could have done this? Why had Rachel been at the church so late? Had someone overheard their confrontation? Or was there something darker at play, something Samantha had yet to discover? The officer's words echoed in her mind. A violent attack. The Rachel she had spoken to just hours ago was now lying cold and lifeless, her life stolen in a way Samantha couldn't comprehend. She clutched her hands together, trying to still the tremors that ran through her body. The doubts that had gnawed at her now seemed trivial. The lies, the betrayals, what did they matter in the face of murder? Samantha knew one thing for certain. Rachel's death wasn't just an accident or a random crime. There were too many secrets, too many lies tangled in their lives for it to be that simple. And now, Samantha found herself at the center of a storm she couldn't escape. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. The nightmare wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun, and somehow she knew that Rachel's death was just the start of something far more dangerous. The question was, what else had Rachel been hiding? And how far was Samantha willing to go to find out? Hours blurred as Samantha sat at the kitchen table, paralyzed by the news of Rachel's death. The weight of grief and confusion pressed heavily on her chest. Just as she began to piece together her next steps, the door swung open and David stepped inside. His face was pale and his movements were stiff, as if he already sensed that something was wrong. "You need to come home," Samantha had told him earlier on the phone. "Rachel is dead." David dropped his keys on the counter, his wide eyes full of disbelief. "Rachel's dead," he whispered, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. Samantha nodded, her gaze fixed on him. She didn't have the strength to offer any comforting words. There was too much left unsaid, too much broken between them. Before they could say more, a knock sounded at the door, and Samantha's heart skipped a beat. 2 detectives stood on the porch, Detective Allison Gray, with sharp eyes and a composed demeanor, and her partner, a quiet man with a notepad in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner?" Detective Gray asked as Samantha opened the door. "We need to ask you both a few questions regarding Rachel Williams." They sat down in the living room, and Samantha felt David shift uncomfortably beside her. The tension was thick, the air heavy with suspicion and unspoken fears. "When was the last time you saw Rachel?" Detective Gray asked, her tone professional but measured. Samantha swallowed hard, knowing that the truth was her only option. "Yesterday," she admitted. "I went to her house." "What was the purpose of your visit?" the detective pressed. Samantha glanced at David, then back at the detectives. "I confronted her," she said quietly. "I found out she had been meeting with David. I needed to know why." David flinched at her words but remained silent. His hands fidgeted nervously in his lap, betraying his discomfort. "And how did the conversation end?" Detective Gray asked, jotting down notes in her notepad. "I told her we were done," Samantha said, her voice steady but brittle. "I said she'd lost me and I left. That was the last time I saw her." Detective Gray's expression remained neutral as she turned her attention to David. "Mr. Turner, when was the last time you saw Rachel?" David cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "At the fundraiser," he said quickly. I didn't see her after that." Samantha clenched her fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. She knew he was lying. Rachel's messages were proof of that. But now wasn't the time to expose him. Rachel was dead, and nothing would change that. The detectives exchanged a brief glance before closing their notepads. "Thank you for your cooperation," Detective Gray said, rising from her seat. "We may have more questions as the investigation progresses. In the meantime, if you remember anything at all, Please reach out to us." Samantha nodded, the weight of their words settling heavily on her shoulders. As the detectives left, an unbearable silence filled the room. David sat with his head in his hands, guilt radiating off him in waves. "Why did you lie to them?" Samantha asked softly, her voice laced with bitterness. David looked up, his eyes filled with shame. "I didn't want them to think I was involved," he muttered. "But you were with her, weren't you?" Samantha's voice grew sharper. "You saw her after the fundraiser, didn't you?" David lowered his gaze, the truth finally slipping through the cracks. "Yes," he whispered. "I met her, but I swear, Sam, I didn't hurt her. I didn't kill her." Samantha stood abruptly, unable to bear the sight of him. "You've been lying to me from the beginning," she hissed. "How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" David's shoulders slumped, his voice cracking with desperation. "I know I messed up, but I swear to you, I didn't do this." Samantha stared at him, her mind racing with questions and doubts. The man she had once loved now felt like a stranger, wrapped in secrets and lies. And Rachel's brutal death had left her world shattered beyond recognition. One thing was certain: whoever had killed Rachel was still out there. Whether it was David or someone else, Samantha was determined to find out, and she knew that the search for the truth had only just begun. 2 days after the detective's visit, Samantha sat quietly by the window, staring out at the world beyond her home. Everything felt surreal: Rachel's betrayal, her confrontation with David, and now the violent death that loomed over them all. As she tried to piece together the fragments of her shattered life, her phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. It was Detective Gray. Samantha's heart pounded as she answered. "Hello?" "Mrs. Turner, we've uncovered new information," Detective Gray said, her tone calm but edged with tension. "We now believe Rachel's death may not have been random." Samantha sat up straighter, gripping the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" "We've found evidence suggesting Rachel was involved in multiple affairs," Gray explained carefully. "She wasn't just seeing your husband. There were others, people from the church, including at least one married man, and not everyone knew about it." Samantha's stomach churned as the detective's words sunk in. Multiple affairs? She thought she knew everything about Rachel, but this revelation painted a far darker picture than she had imagined. "Are you saying someone killed her out of jealousy?" Samantha whispered, her mind reeling. "It's possible," Detective Gray admitted. "One of the individuals we're looking into is a husband who recently discovered his wife had been involved with Rachel. He has no alibi for the night of her death." Samantha sat in stunned silence, the phone pressed against her ear. The idea that Rachel's murder was connected to another affair made her betrayal feel even more twisted. All the time Samantha had spent agonizing over David's involvement. Now it seemed there were other players in the game, people with motives just as strong, if not stronger. "Does this mean David is cleared?" Samantha asked cautiously, her voice low. "We aren't ruling anyone out," Detective Gray replied, "but we're expanding the investigation. There are several individuals who might have wanted Rachel out of their lives. We'll continue questioning all parties involved." Samantha let out a shaky breath. The revelation left her with mixed emotions. On one hand, the possibility that David might not be guilty gave her a flicker of relief. On the other, knowing Rachel had been entangled with multiple lovers made everything feel even more surreal. How had Rachel hidden so much from her? So many secrets, so many lies. "Thank you for the update," Samantha whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Please keep me informed if you find anything else." After hanging up, she remained motionless, her thoughts spiraling. Rachel hadn't just betrayed her, she had betrayed many others, and one of them had taken her life. But who? Was it the jealous husband Detective Gray mentioned, or was it someone else lurking in the shadows, someone willing to kill to keep their secrets buried? Samantha stared at the empty room around her, her mind swirling with possibilities. Her focus had shifted. No longer was this just about David's lies. This was about uncovering the truth behind Rachel's death. Someone had killed her friend, and whoever it was, they were still out there. The puzzle pieces shifted in Samantha's mind, but the picture remained incomplete. She knew one thing. If Rachel had been tangled in so many affairs, the web of suspects was far larger than she had anticipated, and the truth was now more dangerous than ever. Samantha clenched her fists, a new resolve forming within her. She wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth, not just about Rachel's betrayal, but about who had taken her life. There were answers out there, hidden among the lies and deceit, and Samantha was determined to find them, no matter what it took. The tension in the air was suffocating as Samantha sat in the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. Days had passed since Detective Gray's last call, and the unanswered questions weighed heavily on her. Each moment felt like a ticking clock, counting down toward an inevitable truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. That evening, David remained shut in his study, avoiding her as he had done for days. But Samantha couldn't wait any longer. She marched to the door and threw it open, startling him as he looked up from his desk. "Enough, David," Samantha said sharply. "I need the truth, now." David blinked, visibly shaken by the force in her voice. "Sam, no more lies," she cut him off. "You said you met with Rachel that night. What really happened? What did you say to her?" David sagged back into his chair, running his hands over his face. "I met her to end things," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I told her it was over, that I couldn't lie to you anymore." Samantha's throat tightened, the admission confirming what she had suspected. "And then?" she whispered, leaning forward. "She got upset," David said softly. "She begged me not to leave, but I told her it was too late. I told her I loved you and that it was over between us. She left, crying." He exhaled a shaky breath. "That was the last time I saw her." Samantha's mind whirled. If David was telling the truth, then he hadn't hurt Rachel, but someone else had. Someone connected to the tangled web Rachel had woven. Before she could respond, Samantha's phone buzzed on the table. She hesitated, then picked it up, her heart racing as she saw Detective Gray's name on the screen. "Mrs. Turner," Detective Gray's voice came through, calm but heavy. "We've made an arrest." Samantha's breath caught. "Who?" "It's the husband of one of Rachel's lovers," the detective said. "We found evidence placing him at the scene. He confessed to killing her in a fit of rage after learning about her affairs." Samantha's knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, the weight of the news crashing down on her. "It wasn't David," she whispered, as much to herself as to the detective. "No," Detective Gray confirmed. "We found no evidence linking your husband to Rachel's death." Samantha hung up, her mind reeling. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with deep sadness. Rachel had been killed, not by David, but by a man consumed by jealousy and betrayal. The truth was cruel and ugly, but at least now she knew. David sat across from her, his face pale and drawn. "It's over?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Samantha nodded slowly. "They arrested someone else." David let out a shuddering breath, relief flickering across his features, but Samantha knew the damage had already been done. Rachel's betrayal, David's lies, none of it could be undone. The trust they had once shared was broken, and no arrest could change that. Samantha rose from the couch, her movements slow and deliberate. "I need time," she whispered. "Time to figure out where we go from here, if we go anywhere at all." David didn't try to stop her. He only nodded, the guilt and regret etched across his face. Samantha turned and walked toward the door, knowing that their marriage, like everything else, was in ruins. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her like a wave. She stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the reality of it all sink in. The truth had been uncovered, but it had left scars that would take a lifetime to heal. Rachel was gone, her life a tragic reminder of the consequences of lies and betrayal. David was still there, but the love they once shared was a distant memory, and Samantha knew that moving forward would mean starting over, alone, if necessary. With one last glance back at the house she had once called home, Samantha stepped into the night. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and this time she would walk it without looking back.